Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for coming on this very cold night. Thank you all for coming out, and welcome to the first event in the Seán Hales Centenary Commemoration Weekend. The agenda for the night is that we have two speakers, Liz Gillis and Gabriel Doherty, who will each speak for about 45 minutes, and I'm just saying that deliberately now. This will be followed by a brief question and answer session, and the evening will conclude then with tea and coffee and some light nibbles. I would invite you all to stay on for the teas and coffees and the nibbles, because there's a lot of very interesting memorabilia which the Cork Museum and the Hales family have brought in, and it's all displayed down there, and it's worth looking at when the question and answer session is over. And in that regard, I would like to thank the Cork Museum and the Hales family for their support for this event, and also a reenactment group called Lord Edward's Own. These three guys in uniforms down there. They tell me they're not really army, but I'll take their word on it. Okay, 2022 has been a great year for those of us who are interested in Irish history. We've had multiple commemoration events with lots of press coverage, and then we've had lots of newspaper articles, TV programs, podcasts, etc. And as Conor Keane said at the launch of the Centenary Weekend, he said it's a good thing that at long last we have put what he called the Great Silence behind us. And by that he meant the Great Silence about the period 1918 to 1923. As you may have seen in the recent TG4 programme about West Cork, that period, 1918 to 23, was a very difficult and indeed sometimes brutal period around Bandon. But at last now, a light is being shed on all of that, and in the long run, I think it's a good thing that the truth comes out. In the long run. One other effect of this focus on Irish history is that Irish historians have now replaced epidemiologists and immunologists as the media rock stars. And in terms of Irish historians, we're very lucky here tonight to have the equivalent of Bruce Springsteen and Tina Turner, otherwise known as Gabriel Doherty and Liz Gillis. Liz is from the Liberties in Dublin. She currently works as a researcher in RTE with the RTE History Programme, and has been a tour guide in Kilmainham Jail for many years, and she also lectures in the Champlain College in Dublin. Liz is the author of 6 books on the Irish Revolutionary period, one of which is The Hales Brothers and the Irish Revolution, which will be the topic of her talk tonight. Gabriel is a senior lecturer in UCC. He's a renowned expert on the Irish Revolutionary period and the Civil War. He has written 5 books on various aspects of Irish history, and has also published numerous articles on the Irish Revolutionary period. Gabriel has been an active participant in many of the commemoration events in recent weeks, and I know from my own knowledge that he's very much in demand for those events. So look, I'm really looking forward to the speeches from these two people tonight. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Liz Gillis.
Thanks a million, Ted, and I'd just like to say a huge thank you to the Munster Arms for hosting tonight's event, and to the organisers of the weekend's events, and just personally a huge thank you to the Hales family, who've just been so kind to me since 2005, 2006, when I began my journey researching the Hales family. So I'll just get stuck in. So the Hales family, what I suppose piqued my interest in them was that any book that mentioned the Irish Civil War always mentions the Hales brothers, and that they symbolised the tragedy of the Civil War. But there was very little that was written about the Hales family. Peter Hart had written a chapter in his book, The IRA and Its Enemies. Of course, they're mentioned in Liam Deasy's book, Tom Barry mentions them, but actually looking at the family as a whole. And I wanted to find out more about them. And luckily enough, I called Seán Hales Jr., who answered the phone to me, and this girl from Dublin just rang and said, I'm researching your family, will someone talk to me? And he said, my dad will, and that's where the journey began. But by talking to Mr. Hales and by researching and looking into the family more, there's such a story to tell. But looking at their early life, it was very clear to me that the Hales family were always going to be involved in something, whether it was the revolution that they were involved in, or labour. There was something that they were always going to do. And that has to be sort of the work or the influence of their father, Robert Hales, who was a member of the Fenians. And we cannot underestimate that generation, the fathers and mothers of that generation of revolutionaries who told the stories to their children of the famine. Some of them had lived through the famine. They were children themselves. They had witnessed the evictions during the Land War. And that power of the oral tradition in Ireland, it is still so important. So the Hales children were influenced very early on through their father, Robert. And they weren't long in becoming active themselves. And we see the first indication of their activism in 1907, and it is Seán Hales who actually ends up in prison because of his activities. And this was in response to their father's cattle being impounded. And they thought this was an injustice, and Seán Hales, his brothers and their neighbours determined to do something about it. And as you can see from this newspaper article, it did make the newspapers. And just to read it out a little bit to you, it says, cattle seizure at Bandon, rescued by force, police court proceedings. Yesterday at a police court held in the courthouse in Bandon before Mr. A.G. Harrell, 3 men were charged by District Inspector Langhorne with unlawfully and forcibly breaking into the pound at Bandon and rescuing cattle which were rightfully seized and impounded there by the Sheriff's bailiff. 3 cattle has had already been reported belong to Mr. Robert Hales, a respectable farmer residing at Knocknacarra, a distance of about 4 miles to the east of the town of Bandon. The defendants were John Hales, son of Mr. Robert Hales, John Deasy, a farmer's son, residing at Derrycool and a tenant on the Arnott estate, and James Donovan, a labourer residing at Gallows Hill in Bandon. Now, there was so much organisation that went into this event. Not only had you got all their friends and neighbours involved, but it seems pretty much all of the town was involved in this, because when they make their way into the pound, you have Seán Hales and these 2 friends being right in the centre, but when you have the police trying to resist them from entering into the pound, you have the townspeople actually joining in, and they successfully release the cows, and they all march off cheering and shouting at what they have done. This is a blow that has been struck. But for their efforts, they received 2 weeks imprisonment. But this is a sign of the early activism of the Hales family. But then we see with 1912, you have the introduction or the promise that Home Rule will be introduced to Ireland, that Ireland will get some form of self-government. Now, the immediate response to this is the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force in Ulster, who threatened to resist the introduction of Home Rule by force of arms if necessary. There was no one to protect Home Rule, so the Irish National Volunteers are set up to protect Home Rule. And here we see Tom Hales, the first member of the Hales family, actually becoming a member of the Volunteers. And here we see Tom circled there as a member of the Irish Volunteers. This photograph being taken in Shear Street. But his brothers soon followed him. They weren't long behind him in joining him in the Irish Volunteers. And although Tom was the younger of the 2 brothers, Seán was 12 years old than him, it is Tom that is the first to join. And the first volunteer company to be set up in West Cork in this area was the Kilpatrick Company, set up by William Keys MacDonald, and that is the company that Tom himself did join. But the others followed soon after. Now you have Tom, and there's these letters where Tom is saying that he wants to actually set up his own volunteer company, and he writes for permission to the commanding officers in Cork, or of the Cork Brigade, Terence McSweeney and Tomas McCourtin, for permission to actually set up a company of volunteers, promising that he could have 100 men And he wasn't lying, because when the Ballinadee Company of Volunteers was set up, it was a small group to start with, but it gradually did increase. And it became one of the outstanding volunteer companies in all of Ireland at that time. They took part in the funeral of O'Donovan Rossett in 1915, and they also won awards on St. Patrick's Day in 1916, even recognised by Patrick Pearse for their achievements. But then we come to 1916, and we have Tom Hales being in charge of the battalion, and we have Seán involved, Robert and Liam. Donal, of course, was in Italy at this time. And although the events of Easter week were centred in Dublin, Cork was ready to rise. The arms that were meant to be landed from the Odd, they were meant to land in the south and to be distributed across the rest of the counties. Of course, the arms were not landed, and we have people ready to march out. They did march out on Easter Monday. The whole countermand order coming from Mo McNeill, cancelling the original date of the start of the rising from the 23rd, and then it begins on the 24th, caused a lot of confusion. But Tom Hales and his men were ready to go into action. However, word came from the commanding officers in Cork City that they were to take no action. You had the events with Thomas Kent, where you had a shootout and the police were killed, of which Thomas Kent was to be later executed. But Tom Hales was not willing to listen to his commanding officers. He wanted to act. And he says to them, if you cannot send me men, send me arms. Now, an arrangement had been agreed between the authorities and the commanding officers of the Cork Brigade of the Volunteers, that if they surrendered their arms, then no one would be arrested. And Tom Hales was told that that was the order that were to follow, and Tom Hales would not listen. Terence McSweeney with others goes to the family home at Knocknacarra. They were there to discuss this surrender, and unfortunately the police did renege on their deal, and those who did surrender arms, they were arrested. Now, this is where we have the roundups, the mass roundups that happen of people who are not actually involved in the fighting in Dublin. And of course, caught up in this roundup are Robert Hales, Liam Hales. Seán was arrested 5 weeks after the rising had ended, but Tom evaded capture. But this was something that he did not forget. And when the reorganisation began in 1917, he actually wanted to court-martial the commanding officers for the order that they had given to surrender their arms. Now, when they were arrested, you have Seán, Robert and Liam being held with all of the others in Richmond Barracks in Dublin. This, of course, is where the court-martials had taken place. But because they were not put on trial, although they were known to the authorities, they were not seen to be ringleaders, they were deported firstly to prisons in England, and then they end up in Frongach internment camp. And they're the prisoners that are released on Christmas Eve 1916. But Frongach has quite rightly been called the University of Revolution, because this is where the volunteers began to reorganise, and this is where you have the real nucleus of the West Cork IRA being born in Frongach, because it was people like Michael Collins, the Hales brothers, Gerard O'Sullivan, all people who are going to become big names in the coming years. And as we see throughout the War of Independence period, and even in the Civil War period, for those who were actually interned or in prison, they often kept autograph books. And this is an entry from Seán in an autograph book that was kept in Frongach. I don't know whose autograph book it was, but it was a poem that he wrote in it. And just to read it out to you, he said, though all the bright dreams... Sorry, I have to put the glasses on. Sorry, I'm getting a bit old now. Though all the bright dreams we cherished went down in disaster and woe, the spirit of old is still with us, though they never would bend to a foe. And Connacht is ready whenever the loud rolling tuck of the dream rings out to awaken the echoes and tell us the morning has come. Men of the West. John Hales, Ballinadee Company of Irish Volunteers, Ballinadee, County Cork. So the homecoming, it happens, as I said, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, 1916. Now the Ireland that they left in mid-1916, it was an Ireland that was hostile to them, because the people, certainly in Dublin, did not support the Easter Rise, and the First World War was raging, the city was destroyed. But that all changed in a very short time, thanks to the way the British government handled everything, with the executions, with the mass arrests. And they came home as heroes, and the reorganisation began very, very quickly of the Irish Volunteers. The thing is, with the volunteers, it would have been so easy for them to go back to violent methods. But the Republican movement didn't. They tried to go down the political route. And you have a lot of by-elections that take place in 1917, the Irish Parliamentary Party being the biggest political party in the country, the Home Rule Party. But Sinn Féin, which was the moderate nationalist party taken over by the Republicans, they began to put forward candidates in the by-election. So they go down that political route and they began to have successes. You have Eamon de Valera elected, you have Joseph McGuinness elected, and many others. W.T. Cosgrave is another. To try to curb the rise of Sinn Féin, you have this event, what's known as the German plot. 1918 was another turning point in the whole sort of story of the revolution, because the British government threatened to introduce conscription to Ireland. The First World War was still raging. Britain had not introduced conscription to Ireland. They desperately needed men to fill their army, so they threatened to introduce conscription. But you have this national campaign where pretty much the whole country says no to the British government. But what they do amid this is come up with this plot, the German plot. And basically, and everyone knew it was a fabrication, they believed or said that the Republicans were in cahoots with the Germans again. There was going to be another rising, so they were going to stop it before it could even start. So you have these arrests taking place. Now, in Dublin, word was got to the Republicans like Michael Collins and so on. Some heeded the advice. Collins was not captured, Harry Boland was not captured, Calabrew was not captured. Others like De Valera said, let them come, we'll use it to our advantage. And you have upwards of 80 members of Sinn Féin, including a number of women, arrested. And this is where they come looking for Seán Hales. And again, this made the newspapers. And if you read the witness statements, it just jumps off the page, because the RAC came to the family home in Knocknacarra looking for Seán. He was a prominent member of the Republican movement, but they didn't get him. Now you have Madge, their sister, and her cousin Hannah are in the house when the police come. Tom and William were in Flynn's house a few fields away. And you have the police just entering. It's pretty much a raid that takes place in the house. And it could have went disastrously wrong, because Seán Hales was prepared to shoot the police officers, but somehow in the excitement that was going on, Hannah managed to get word to another cousin that was in the house, to get word to Tom and Liam and the Flynns, to get them to come back. And what they did, and it shows the capabilities of Tom Hales as a leader, as a quick thinker, because although there was only 3 or 4 of them, what they did, they spread themselves across the fields and started to shout and roar to each other. So it actually looked like there was a whole army of volunteers descending on Knocknacarra to take on the police. And some of the police actually resigned on the spot that night. Seán Hales managed to escape. He was going to shoot a police officer, but his father begged him not to because of what had happened with Thomas Kent, and he managed to escape. But that was now his life on the run, and the family home at Knocknacarra was now a place that was going to be raided constantly over the coming years. So the volunteers, or the Irish Republican Army as they became known in 1919, in Cork in particular, there had to be a lot of reorganisation, because in 1916 there was only one Cork brigade. It was a massive area. So it was decided to split the Cork brigade into 3 brigades, so Cork number 1, Cork number 2, Cork number 3. And Tom Hales, on the recommendations of Michael Collins, because Collins was known to the Hales family, they were friends, but he trusted Tom Hales and his leadership and his abilities as a leader, and he believed that he was the man that could actually take charge of the Cork number 3 brigade, and that is exactly what happens. So here we have Tom Hales, OC of Cork number 3, and then below we've got Tom Barry, because as the War of Independence went on, so many men were on the run, it was too dangerous for them to be at home. The police were looking for them, especially when the RAC, the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans arrived, and they're just determined to destroy them. So flying columns were set up, pretty much full-time mobile units of IRA who would take the fight to the enemy. And one of the most famous flying columns, of course, was the 3rd West Cork Brigade flying column under the leadership of Tom Barry. Now, the War of Independence in 1919, it is slow to take off. You have the events down in Tipperary that signal the beginning of the War of Independence with the shooting of the 2 RIC men by Dan Breen and Seán Tracy. There's an assassination war that takes place in Dublin on the orders of Michael Collins against the DMP, the G Division, which was very, very successful. The British were caught off guard. But then the British begin to reorganise. They bring over intelligence officers from England, and then they recruit 2 or more recruits into the RIC, which, due to the policy being carried out by the IRA, the RIC were the eyes and ears, they were the front line of the Crown Forces, of the British administration, and they were being targeted. But it was very difficult to get people to join the RIC. So you have the full-time force being recruited mainly from across England, Scotland and Wales, although there were a few Irishmen who joined up to the ranks of the Black and Tans. And they arrive in March 1920, and then they're followed soon after in July by the auxiliaries, a completely different force, a temporary force whose sole aim was to destroy the IRA. But the rise of Sinn Féin continues. You have the success of the 1918 general election. They wiped the floor with the Irish Parliamentary Party. They are the political party. The Dáil is set up on the 24th of January 1919. But where the real power lay was local government. And we have a series of local elections in January and June 1920. And this is where we see Republican figures being elected as Lord Mayors. Sinn Féin again, they dominate the councils. But this is where these public figures now become targets of the Crown Forces. And we see this, it really is brought home with the murder of Tomás McCourtin, who was the OC of the Cork Brigade in 1916, who was elected Lord Mayor in those elections in 1920, and who was murdered in front of his heavily pregnant wife in March 1920. And then behind him, we see Terence McSweeney, his successor, his comrade in arms, who then died in October 1920 as a result of the hunger strike that he undertook as a result of his imprisonment. So you can see that public figures, people that are democratically elected by the people of Ireland, are now becoming targets. And you can see that the war is descending into a state of viciousness. And on the radar of the authorities is Tom Hales, Seán Hales, and those key figures within the West Cork IRA. Now, whereas in all of the country, there were a number of forces that the IRA had to deal with. So in Dublin, you've got the British intelligence officers, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, who are pretty neutral. They weren't really active against the IRA in Dublin. You do have the RIC. There are Black and Tans in Dublin. There's a lot of auxiliaries, and then there's the British military. But down in Cork, you do have the Black and Tans, you do have the auxiliaries, but then you have the Essex Regiment. Now, while a lot of the military regiments, the actual British regiments in the army, were not bad. You actually have some IRA men saying they preferred to be arrested by a British soldier rather than an auxiliary, because at least you knew that you'd get out alive. That could not be said in the case of the Essex Regiment, who were as bad, if not worse, than the auxiliaries. And we see this with what happens on the 27th of July 1920 with the arrest of Tom Hales and Pat Hart in Lara's farmhouse, if I'm not mistaken. Now, Tom Hales wrote an account of what happened to him. Michael Collins was determined that word should get out, and there are a lot of documents relating to what happened, but both men were arrested, they were interrogated, they were brutally beaten before they were taken into custody, and then they were brutally tortured while in custody. There are also documents from the British side where they refute the claims that were made against them. Now, what the British say is that they may have gotten a punch in the face, and excuse the language here, but one officer said that Tom Hales or Pat Hart had called the soldiers English bastards, and they got a smack in the face. But when he saw that happen, he stopped it. This photograph from the Imperial War Museum shows that it was a lot more than a punch in the face that they got. You cannot deny that they had endured brutal treatment there, but unfortunately more was to follow. And there is an account of it in the newspapers, and just to read it out to you, it says, awful story of torture. London journalist report of frightful Irish happenings. The Daily News and other London papers published prominently today an extraordinary account of happenings in the County Cork. The Daily News narrative is forwarded. An accredited representative of the Irish Republican government has sent me a copy of a statement that was made and signed by Tom Hales. So this was sent out to the people, and this is what Tom says, just an excerpt of it. And it says, Captain A also put to the pincers on my thighs, but my senses were becoming quite numb. After that, and finding that I would answer no questions, he told me I would be shot at dawn. Lieutenant B then untied my hands and told me to pull up my trousers. I did so, and my trousers were sopping with blood. Captain A said the court is closed for the finding. Lieutenant B then landed me a terrific punch in the face. I said I would not defend myself. I would not give them an excuse to say I had hit them. Lieutenant B hit me several times in various parts of the body, but especially in the face, and he broke the forefront teeth in my upper jaw. He then knocked me down on the ground. I was absolutely exhausted, nearly fainted, and my senses were beginning to go. He hit me on several occasions while I was on the ground. Now, they tried to deny that any of this happened. A doctor who actually visited Tom and Per Hart after this, he said he had never actually seen wounds like the ones that were inflicted on those men. So this story was not bought, that they were not ill-treated, certainly by the public. Now, this is one of the men who was responsible for the torture, the interrogation that happened, Captain Kelly. And you saw in that photograph what the flag, what Per Hart is holding up, is the Union Jack. And Tom talks about this in his account, that they tried to make Tom hold up the flag, the Union Jack, but he knew what it was and he refused to hold it up. But you can see in that photograph, Per Hart, it's just like there's a glazed expression across his face. You're wondering, does he actually know what he's holding up in his hands? The story of Per Hart is tragic, because both men were sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. They were sent to prison in England, and Michael Collins had people go into prison to check on them. Per Hart was showing signs of a nervous breakdown. The prison authorities thought he was play acting, that it was all an act, and they refused to give him any help. And there are letters from people saying that they'd visited Tom, they'd visited Per Hart. Per Hart seemed to be okay, he was on the mend, and then something happened. Something changes that makes Per Hart really tip over the edge. And Collins is begging them to find out what it is, and what they found out is that this man, Captain Kelly, actually visited Per Hart in prison. And it's like he almost knew that Per Hart was teetering on the brink. And the reason that they were arrested and what they were tried for was for the shooting of an RIC policeman. And Kelly says to Hart, we are going to get you for the murder of Munster, we're going to get you. And it seems that is what pushed him over the edge. Now, the IRA tried many times to get Kelly for Hart and Hales. He went around often dressed as a woman to try to evade them. They never got their hands on him, but they were looking for him, and that's all in the Collins intelligence papers. But unfortunately for Per Hart, he ended up in an asylum, and then eventually he was brought home to Ireland once the treaty was signed, and he ended his days in 1924 in the Richmond Asylum in Dublin. Now, while all this is going on, you have these successes being carried out or being won by the Crown Forces, but the way the War of Independence goes, it's like the British have successes, they think they've got the IRA on their knees, and then the IRA hit back, and this is the way the war is played out. We see that towards the end of 1920, where you have so many successes against the IRA, but then in West Cork they hit back with Kilmichael. You've then got the burning of Cork in response to that. There are executions that take place in Cork of the volunteers, but then the IRA again hit back with events like the Crossbarry ambush, of which Seán Hales, Robert and Liam Hales were all involved, Seán being a section commander. And this was a huge operation involving pretty much all of the West Cork Brigade flying column. hugely outnumbered by the authorities, but they managed to evade arrest and inflict heavy casualties on the Crown forces. But this is a huge success for the West Cork IRA, showing that they were not defeated. Now, another thing that happens is, we saw with the burning of Cork in 1920 December, there were unofficial reprisals being carried out by the Crown forces. So the authorities thought, well, let's make them official. So for every ambush that happens, we will pick 4 or 5 houses, a business that is supportive of Sinn Féin or the Republican movement, and we will burn that in response to these ambushes. But you have it really hitting home with the Hales family, because their family home was destroyed in March 1921. This is really sending a message home, because Tom is in prison, Seán is on the run, Liam is on the run, Robert is on the run. Now, Madge Hales, and she is the silent voice in all of this. While her brothers were on the run, Madge, like so many women across the country at this time, had to keep everything going. So she was looking after her elderly parents, she was overseeing the running of the farm. The raids that were carried out inevitably at night, because it adds to the fear, to the terror. And there had been raids on the houses, but then this one happens. And the Crown forces destroy the family home. Literally, it is a shell that is left. And I just want to read out a section, a little bit of a letter that Madge wrote to her brother Donal. And I haven't seen this book, that this is an amazing initiative in West Cork. The children, the stories of the revolution told by school children. It is absolutely fantastic to see. And this is written by Seán Hales, this letter from Madge. So again, I'm just going to read out a little bit to you, and I'm going to go right up. I'll speak less. So what she says is, my dear Dan, instead of the happy girl I was when I wrote to you last, I am now a homeless and almost fatherless girl. The best and most loving of fathers is, I must tell you, with a breaking heart and waiting for his call to his happy home. Here the English government can't interfere with him. Oh dear father, what you have seen in your last days, the life or the home you have made, has been burnt to the ground. And I know how the heart piercing so to think that he was turned out of his dying bed without nothing to keep his poor body from cold and rain, with nothing even on his feet. Now that will just give you an idea of what Madge Hales endured, what women all over this country endured at this time. And she had to keep everything going. But that is a personal attack on the Hales family, but they were not to be beaten. Now, you do have the executions taking place, and the response from the IRA in Cork was to kidnap high-profile targets. That if volunteers were going to be executed, then the hostages that were taken, they would also be executed. Now, the biggest target they could get in Bandon was Lord Bandon. So Seán Hales is in charge of a raid to kidnap the Earl of Bandon. Now, when they arrived at the home, he was not there. He could not be found. And Seán Hales, to paraphrase, basically said, well, since the bird has flown the nest, I will destroy it. So Castle Bernard was actually destroyed on the orders of Seán Hales, and nothing but a ruin left. But eventually they do find Lord Bandon, and he is kidnapped. Now, the executions were halted. They didn't take place. There were no executions of the volunteers after this. And despite the best efforts of the authorities, they could not find the Earl of Bandon. There must have been some support network all across this county, because he must have been moved from pillar to post, but no one could get him. He was actually released by the IRA weeks later. But here we have the ruins of Castle Bernard. Now, the truce comes in July 1921, which brings about an end to the War of Independence, and very importantly, the British government looked for this. Before December 1920, you have the British saying, we'll negotiate with you, but you have to give up colonies, you have to give up all these key figures, you have to disarm. But that all changed by June 1921. No conditions, negotiations begin, and the truce comes into effect on the 11th of July 1921. And I love this photograph. These are kids in Dublin, and they're waving a tricolour. And look at their feet though. The kids are actually not wearing shoes. So this photograph paints a thousand words, or tells 1,000 words, because it's shown the reality of life for people at that time. These are desperately poor kids that can't even afford a pair of shoes, but it's all kids in that photograph, and they're all smiling because peace has come to Ireland. But peace was not to last in Ireland for long, and it's after the truce that we find that Lord Bandon is released. Now, he said of his captors that he was treated very well, it could have been the other way, but he was released unharmed, and then he did also put in a compensation claim for the damage that was done to Castle Bernard. And then we come to this event, and I love this photograph because it is a photograph of a happy occasion, but it is such a sad photograph as well, and that is the wedding of Leslie Price and Tom Barry. So Leslie Price, of course, being from Dublin, sent down to West Cork to organise coming them on, and she was the sweetheart of Charlie Hurley, who of course was killed in 1921, and then she and Tom Barry become very close, and they marry on the 22nd of August 1921. This was the wedding of the year. There's no doubt about it, and this was taken in Vaughan's Hotel in Parnell Square. And look who is in the photograph. It is a who's who of the Republican movement. We have Harry Boland, front row, and then we have Michael Collins, just here, just putting his head down. There's Seán Hales, again, putting his head down. There we have Rory O'Connor, just here. It literally is a who's who of the Republican movement. De Valera slap bang in the middle. But although it's a happy event, look at the date. A year from this photograph being taken, Harry Boland was dead. Collins actually died on the date, 22nd of August 1922. A couple of months on, Seán Hales would be dead, Rory O'Connor would be dead. It is such a sad photograph. And why did that happen? Well, we have the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty on the 6th of December 1921. Partition had already existed with the Government of Ireland Act in 1920. And an oath of faithfulness was to be taken to the British Crown. But the treaty did not give the Republic that so many people had fought and died for. But it was signed, it was brought home to Ireland, and immediately the Republican movement split into pro and anti-treaty sides. Now, as a result of the treaty being signed, those who were in prison, those who were in custody, they were to be released. Now you have those who were interned, that were sentenced, are released literally 2 days after the treaty is signed, and then those who are seen to be a bit more dangerous, it takes a little bit longer. But Tom Hales was actually released on the 12th of December from prison in England. And while he was in prison, he was involved in protests. The leadership doesn't end with Tom while he's in prison. He is organising the prisoners to protest because they are being treated as common criminals. He is released, but before he does come home, he visits, as he says in this article here, that he visited Broadmoor Lunatic Asylum, where he found 5 of the Irish prisoners who had been either at Pentonville, Portland or Wormwood Scrubs closely confined. 3 of the 5, he said, are hopeless lunatics. And you wonder, is one of those that he visited his good friend, Pat Hart? But Tom came home, but what was he coming home to? It was an Ireland that was divided. His family home was burnt to the ground. And what also happened, what he did come home to, was that his family was split on the issue of the treaty. So we have Seán and Madge accepting the treaty, and we have Tom, Liam, Robert and Donal, who was in Italy, a Republican consul in Italy, rejecting the treaty. And I have to say this, those who accepted the treaty, those like Seán Hales, and the military men who accepted the treaty, they were Republican. They really did believe in that stepping stone theory of Collins, that this was not the be all and end all, that once we were strong enough, we would get the 6 counties back. And Seán says as much in a meeting of the council where it is said that the anti-treaty side were the Republicans, and he takes offence to this because he and his comrades, they were as much Republican as those who rejected the treaty. But although you have those divisions within the family, they were still able to remain friends. But you have Tom being involved in the leadership. He is rising in the ranks of the anti-treaty IRA. And here we see members of the 4th Southern Division at the IRA convention on the 26th of March 1922 that was held. This photograph was actually taken in around April 1922. But these are the key men of the Cork IRA who had all rejected the treaty, and there we have Tom. And Tom is actually a member of the anti-treaty IRA executive, like a number of others. However, he did not agree with the split that happened within the anti-treaty IRA, where Rory O'Connor and others broke away from the command of Liam Lynch, because what Tom believed and others was that the election that was going to be held on the issue of the treaty, that should be allowed to take place, and whatever the people would vote, well then that was what they should follow, the will of the people. However, situations developed. The forecourt was occupied by members of the anti-treaty IRA executive, including Rory O'Connor and Liam Mellows and Joe McKelvey and others, and then events spiral out of control pretty quickly, and the civil war begins on 28th of June 1922 when the forecourt is attacked by the pro-treaty forces. The fighting in Dublin lasts about 7-10 days. Liam Lynch, who had been arrested in Dublin, was allowed to leave Dublin because the Free State forces at the time didn't believe he was actually as hardline as those like Rory O'Connor. That split that had existed, they didn't know it had been healed. And Dick Barrett was actually in Dublin at the time, and Dick Barrett should have gone with Liam Lynch, but he remained in the forecourt. But Liam Lynch and Liam Deasy managed to make their way back to Cork, and although the Free State forces thought they could keep the fighting controlled in Dublin, once Liam Lynch drove away that day, there was no way they were going to contain it to Dublin. So you have the civil war spreading. And the guerrilla tactics that were so successful in the War of Independence, they are used again by the anti-treaty IRA all around the country. And then we have the visit of Michael Collins, the tour of West Cork that he does in August 1922. And here we have the last photograph of Michael Collins taken before he was shot at Ballinablaw. And all around West Cork you see similar photographs taken during the tour that he went on. But at his last meeting here in Bandon, he talked to Seán Hales, and at this moment, at this time, the anti-treaty IRA were destroying roads, they were destroying bridges, they were putting trees across roads, creating blockades. And Seán Hales, while talking to Collins, insisted and begged and pleaded with him not to go that road. It was too dangerous. There had to be another route that they could take back to Cork, but Collins didn't listen. And while Seán is pleading with Collins to go a safer way, you have at the same time Tom Hales overseeing the ambush at Ballinablaw, in which Collins would be the only casualty. And of course that is what happened on the evening of the 22nd of August. Now, you can imagine Seán's feelings that his brother is involved in this, his two other brothers are on the run. And with the way the war was developing, because 4 days after Collins dies, you have the reprisals taking place, the murders begin to happen. Now, there were a few murders that had taken place, but it ramps up after Collins' death. Two members of the Fianna are taken in broad daylight on the streets of Dublin, murdered in front of people out at the Yellow Lane near Drumcondra. And this sets the scene of what is going to happen. People are shot trying to escape. People are murdered in custody. There was a murder gang operating in Dublin. And Seán, no doubt, feared for the safety of his brother, because if you can imagine, if the Free State forces, and especially people, if they were members of the Dublin Guard, who had been so close to Collins, got their hands on someone like Tom Hales, who was involved in that ambush, God knows what would happen to him. However, we do have, William was arrested in September 1922, Tom was arrested in November, but very quickly he was gotten out of West Cork and he's brought into Cork City. He is out of harm's way. But it is interesting that apparently on the night of the death of Collins, Seán and Tom did meet up, and Tom apparently gave Seán an account or told him of the events, what actually happened at Ballinablaw. So that pressure is off. However, so much was lost, and you do have efforts by members of the pro-treaty forces and the anti-treaty IRA to try to end it. The Free State government actually had tried to give offers of clemency to the anti-treaty IRA. They were telling them to end it because by November 1922, again, the war takes a nasty turn because you have the introduction of the Army Resolutions Bill, the Special Powers Bill, or the Murder Bill as it became known, in which it gave the military the power to set up military courts, and anyone found with a gun or explosives could be executed under this resolution that was set up. The first executions take place on the 17th of November 1922 in Dublin, and in the period of 6-7 months of the Civil War, you have 83 men being executed under this Army Resolutions Bill. But this again leads to another turn being taken in the Civil War, and we see it again, affecting the Haleses. Sorry, the batteries are going in this. Ready? Oh, there we go. We have this event which happens on the 7th of December 1922, which was the assassination of Seán Hales in Dublin outside the Ormond Hotel on the 7th of December. Now, what had happened is that once the Army Resolutions Bill was passed and once the executions had begun, you have an order then coming from Liam Lynch, who basically stated that any TD who had voted for the murder bill was a legitimate target for assassination in the eyes of the anti-treaty IRA. Seán Hales was up to attend the Dáil. He was a TD. He had been elected in 1921, re-elected in 1922. But he was with Pádraig O'Malley, who was the last Count Corla of the Dáil. And as far as I was aware, it was the reason that Seán is going to the Dáil that day was to ask for a proper investigation into what happened at Bandon, because there was no inquest into Collins's death. Inquests were suspended with other cases, but there is no inquest into Collins's death. However, last night I found another piece of evidence that gives a different story. Thanks to Military Archives, who have released another batch of pensions only 2 weeks ago. And we have this account from Nora Doyle, who was a member of Cumann na Món in West Cork, who had worked with the Haleses during the War of Independence and so on. And what she says here in her pension application, she gives another reason as to why Seán was going to the Dáil that day. And just to read it out to you, she says, on a Sunday at the end of November 1922, Seán Hales sent for me and I went to meet him at Drew's Shannon Street in Bandon. He said he was very anxious to try to end the Civil War, and Ennis and Dalton, as in Tom Ennis and Emmett Dalton, they were with him. General Dalton was in the Cork command at the time. We discussed plans for some time. He went up to the barracks and brought down General Tom Ennis, and it was decided that Seán Hales, who was going to Dublin to a meeting of the Dáil, would call a truce at the end of the session. Meantime, try to influence any officers or any others he could to set with him and resign as a protest if they didn't agree. Dalton and Ennis were to take action immediately. I went to Cork and Dalton told me I could send in an account of the matter to Tom Hales, who was in Cork jail, and he gave me instructions that the censor was not to open my letter. Seán was killed in Dublin, so nothing was done. So here we have Seán Hales actually going up to try to bring an end to the fighting. However, Seán Hales is fatally wounded as they're coming out of the Ormond Hotel. There's the full inquest is there, and what seems to have happened is that Seán gets on the Jarvie with Amalia. They were talking to people. Amalia moved a slight distance away, and at that moment, anti-treaty IRA men come out of a street at the side of the Ormond Hotel, Aaron Street East, and they open fire. Seán, it seems, took the full force of the attack. Pádraig O'Malley was wounded, and while you had police there was a British soldier there. He actually heard the shooting and he opens fire on the attackers. The police couldn't even see who it was that actually carried out the shooting because there was crowds of people and they were panicking as soon as they heard the shots. And despite the fact that Jervis Street Hospital is minutes away from where the Ormond Hotel was, it was too far, because within minutes, tragically, Seán Hales was dead. Now, the thing is, he had not voted for this legislation. He was not even in the Dáil when the vote was taken. O'Malley had voted for it. He was the target, and you do have letters from the anti-treaty IRA in Dublin to the West Cork IRA saying Seán was not our target. It is unfortunate, it is tragic that he was killed. And the tributes that poured in about Seán, everyone says he was the last person they would expect to die in this manner, certainly when you consider that he was actually trying to broker an end to the conflict. But tragedy follows tragedy here. We have this letter from Tom Hales printed in the press to his mother on hearing of the death of his brother Seán. He was not allowed out of custody. They would not let him out of the internment camp to attend his brother's funeral. And you see here, my dearest mother, as it was not possible for me to attend poor Seán's funeral, though it would be my wish, I pray God may strengthen and comfort you all under this terrible cross. I can quite understand the terrible shock you all received on hearing of poor Seán's death, and moreover in so brutal a fashion again. May God comfort you all and the country he loved. I myself am going on well. And again, as I said, the tributes just pour in for the man that was Seán Hales. But again, there's tragedy after tragedy, because the very next day we have the Mountjoy Fours, they're called, being taken out of their cells, specifically chosen to send a message to the IRA that one side is going to win this war and it will not be you. And they were to be executed as a reprisal for the shooting of Seán Hales, and the four men were Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Dick Barrett and Joe McKelvey. Now, there is a quote, and you'll see it in a moment, from W.T. Cosgrave, because whereas Seán was trying to end the conflict, the government were also thinking about giving another offer of clemency to the anti-treaty IRA to end it. And here, of course, we have the four men that were executed in Mountjoy. But W.T. Cosgrave, and these are his words here, when asked about the executions, how can this be carried out? How can you justify this? Because there was no legal justification for the executions of these men. They had nothing to do with the shooting of Seán Hales. They were in prison since June 1922, since the fall of the Four Courts. And what President Cosgrave said was, he stated that the night before Seán Hales was assassinated, he and the Minister for Defence, Richard Mulcahy, had agreed that the time had come for clemency. There was only one way to meet this campaign, he said, and that was to smash it. And then you see the executions, they ramp up after December 1922. Tragically again, Dick Barrett, who shouldn't have been there, who shouldn't have been arrested, who was a very close friend of Seán Hales, was executed, and they were chosen to represent a province. So Rory O'Connor, Leinster, Joe McKelvey, Ulster, Liam Mellows, Connacht, and tragically Dick Barrett for Munster. And it was sending a message to the anti-treaty IRA that we will destroy you. And Seán Hales, his funeral took place. You have thousands of people on the streets of Dublin turning out to say goodbye to Seán Hales. And there are so many photographs in the newspapers, and this is the scene repeated over and over and over again from Dublin until he comes home on the 11th of December 1922. And you have people, again, the tributes. We have this resolution from Dublin Corporation, who passed, their vote of sympathy for both the family of Seán Hales, but also for the families of Barrett, McKelvey, O'Connor and Mellows, because they saw the tragedy in this. And even the Hales family themselves saw the tragedy in the executions, and they themselves wrote a letter to the newspaper saying that they did not, Seán would have not wanted these executions to take place, but that was the policy of the government at the time. So the impact of this, it was huge on the family. And again, Madge Hales is the one that is keeping it all together, because her brothers are in prison. She has now lost a brother. Her brother has died. Her father's health was breaking down. And tragically, we see this time and again in the pension files, the begging letters, the horrible letters that are sent by people who have lost loved ones looking for compensation. And this was Madge writing to W.T. Cosgrave, for payment for some help for the family, because although the family had gotten a small gratuity to help rebuild the family home, it wasn't enough. And Seán was the breadwinner. Her brothers were in prison at this time. There was no money coming in. And her mother was such a proud woman that Madge Hales is writing this letter in secret to W.T. Cosgrave, basically saying, you know what we have sacrificed for this country. You know my brother, what he gave up, what the family have given up, and my mother is such a proud woman, she will not write to you and ask for more money. But literally, they were running the risk of taking their family out of the nursing home that he was in. And that is how close to the wire it was. But this is the human side of the revolution. And on the 19th January 1930, we have the unveiling of the memorial to Seán Hales. One of very few, it must be said, 2 National Army soldiers killed in the Civil War. Of course, we have the one to Collins, but what is very, very sad about this is while you have all of the memorials to the anti-treaty IRA who died and were murdered, were killed in the Civil War, the government forgot those who died fighting for the Free State. Pretty much any memorials that were erected were either paid for by the army or by public subscription, and you have that in the case of Seán Hales. And very coldly, it was said, and not relating to Seán Hales, it would be, why would the government pay for a memorial for those who died doing their job? These are people who gave up their lives for the future of their country. And as you can see from this photograph, a huge turnout for the unveiling of the memorial, and hopefully we will see the same again on Sunday. And just before I wrap up, this photograph, I love this photograph because this could not have been taken 30 years before. And this is the photograph taken at the unveiling to the memorial at Sam's Cross in 1965 to Michael Collins. And it is literally, it's like a healing of the divisions that were created in the Civil War. Because here you have members of Michael Collins' squad. You have people who would have killed and did kill for Collins, beside people who were involved in the ambush in which Collins did die. So here we have Tom Hales here. You have Vinnie Byrne beside him. And here we have Joe McGuinness. There we have Tom Barry, there we have Paddy Lawson, Dublin Brigade, and there we have Liam Deasy. This photograph could not have been taken 30 years before, but you wonder in that photograph, in that moment, were they realising what had actually been lost in those 11 months, 1922 to 1923. So much had been lost in that short period of time. And Seán Hales, he was buried in the family plot in Shannon, and beside him lies his brother Robert, and we have Tom and William, and they're buried in Bandon, the graveyard just up the road. So although divided politically, the family were reunited, but it was such a huge price to pay. It was such a huge price that whole generation paid for the freedom of their country. And the question must be asked, did they know what they were signing up to when they joined the volunteers? Did they know the actual cost of what their actions would be? I can't answer that question, and I'm just thankful that I was not in that position 100 years ago, because I do not know what I would have done. But I suppose a comrade, the best way to sum it up, which we do know, one thing we are certain of, in the words of one of their comrades is that for certain they gave, the Hales family, the entire Hales family, gave their all on the altar of their country. Thank you.
Okay, after that virtuoso performance from Tina, all I can say is take it away, Bruce.
wish I had Bruce Springsteen's money, that's all I'll say. I think this might well be a little bit after the Lord Mayor's show when it comes to following Liz. She is a force of nature when it comes to lecturing, but I'll do my best. First of all, just to thank the commemoration committee, the hotel, and particularly the Hales family for the invitation, I suppose, to address you this evening. Well done on a magnificent commemorative programme, and it's fitting that this event and the others be held. You said it took 2 years, and of course that includes COVID. I'm sure there were times when you wouldn't necessarily have been sure that you would have been able to do it, but I think we're all glad that we're all being able to gather here, so well done. I have a slightly different approach to Liz. I'm going to be having a look at the Civil War, but through a British lens. Not looking, as it were, at the events within Ireland from within. Interesting and significant and vital though that is. But to look from it from without. What these events looked like, at least through the prism of the British press, during that period. So we're going to have a look at, hopefully this will work, just say a few introductory words. When I was preparing this talk, I prepared probably about 10 times more material than we're going to have in the talk, and I still think I've probably got twice as much as I will need to cover in the time. So I really had to settle for just the first 6 months of the Civil War. So we're just going to have a look at the British press coverage of 4 discrete events, culminating in the coverage in Britain of the death of Seán Hales. So we're going to have a look at how the British looked at the attack on the forecourts, how the British covered the death of Michael Collins, the death of Erskine Childers, and I said the death of Seán Hales. There is an important distinction, I think, that has to be made between how the British treated the death of Hales and the earlier events. As well, the early events were a process. There was a build-up to the attack on the forecourts. Basically, you have a week between the assassination of Henry Wilson in London, and that's the trigger event, without a doubt, for the attack on the forecourts. The death of Michael Collins comes to a certain extent out of the blue, but the press coverage then continues for several days afterwards because of the funeral. The death of Erskine Childers is, of course, preceded by his trial, and there are a number of appeals which strung the whole thing out over 4 or 5 days. With regard to Seán Hales, unfortunately what happens is that there is such a press of very significant events on the days the 6th, 7th and 8th of December that, as tragic as the death was, it had to take its place among these other landmark events, and I'll hope to illustrate that as we go along. Okay, some general points. First of all, of course, in those days there was no TV, radio or internet or podcasts. The press was it. The only other media through which people got information about current affairs was the newsreels in the cinema. But of course, a newsreel could only put up 4 or 5 words, perhaps, for any particular story. So there is no comparison between, as it were, the information you got from a newspaper and the newspaper you got from a newsreel. There were massive sales in the newspaper industry in those days. I think somebody has quoted something like 10 times as many papers sold in those days as there are now. There was very, of course, intense competition as a consequence between various different titles, both nationally and locally. There were, of course, a number of competing titles here in Cork. And, of course, each paper had to distinguish itself editorially from the competition. And one point I should note is just the amount of newspapers actually contained in those days. If you have a look at the number of words per page on a newspaper in those days and contrast it to the paucity of coverage on, as it were, the average page now, even though there are, of course, different pages, there was just an awful lot of news in newspapers. One thing I'm determined I want to convey is that we're looking at British perspectives. There is no one British perspective on the Civil War, any more than there was only one Irish perspective on the Civil War. And each of the newspapers we're going to be looking at in detail had their own party political allegiances, and as a consequence, each had their own particular take, their own particular spin on the events. Remember that there are a lot of things happening in Britain at the same time that the Irish Civil War was going on, and of course this affected and influenced how the British viewed what was happening in Ireland. In particular, remember that the British government that had overseen both the War of Independence and the treaty was in the process of disintegration. This government had had a huge Conservative majority, but had voluntarily entered into a coalition with a fraction of the Liberal Party in December 1918. The Conservative majority had become increasingly uneasy and unhappy with what they saw as the undue influence of the Liberals in the government. And in particular, a lot of them were unhappy with the Anglo-Irish Treaty, not just the die-hard wing, which opposed any concessions to Ireland, but a more mainstream, as it were, Conservative backbenchers who supported the treaty when it was signed, but had become increasingly uneasy about the developments with regard to the treaty in the intervening 6 months. They were also worried about the proposals to give India self-government, and of course then, as now, you had a cash for honours scandal. There always seems to be one when the Conservatives are in power, although actually this one was more Lloyd George, the Liberal. So halfway through this period, you have the government falls on the 19th of October. The Conservatives walk out of the coalition. And if we nowadays hear the 1922 committee, you sometimes hear this in the Conservative backbenchers, this is where that committee is formed. Bonar Law, the leader of the Conservatives, became Prime Minister temporarily, and then there's a general election in November. So all of this is happening in Britain at the same time as the Civil War, and of course there was a domestic focus. Just in terms specifically of the press, remember that much of the coverage, particularly in the provincial papers, is basically the same. They take the information from the so-called wire services, particularly like the Press Association. Another point is, remember in those days, actually until quite recently, many of the quality papers carried only advertisements on their front pages. It was considered to be a little down at heel to actually carry news on the front page. So page one headlines, which of course we nowadays associate with the most important stories, in those cases many of the most important stories were carried inside on pages 6 or 7. Just in terms of the sources that I've used, I've just put 2 web addresses up there. If you want to do your own research, you're absolutely open to do so. I will be leaving this presentation on the hard drive, so if anyone wants a copy, you can certainly have a look at it. One point to note is that this is going to be a very sort of text heavy. There aren't that many images, so I'm going to be doing an awful lot of reading, and I haven't necessarily got the best reading voice. So. Okay, we're going to have a look in particular at 3 newspapers and how these 3 newspapers covered each of these events, and there are some subtle differences between them. The first was the Daily Telegraph, which has been described as an organ of moderate conservatism. Not sure what moderation means in that context. It certainly was not a die-hard newspaper. That was the Morning Post, which was the Hang'em and Flog 'em brigade. Daily circulation, nearly 250,000. They had very intense competition from the 2 other best-known Tory titles then and now, the Mail and the Express. It was a pretty dull paper. Partly as a consequence of the fact that he had an editor who'd basically been there for 35 years, and he was himself 85 years old. And you do get a little bit of the sense of a lack of adventure in how the paper covered certain stories, particularly in its editorials, and we are going to be looking primarily at the editorials. It was, of course, as you'd expect, a supporter of the coalition government, being a Conservative. The Manchester Guardian at that time was aligned with the Liberal Party, nowadays of course probably better known as aligned with the Labour Party. A very different beast. Nominally a provincial paper based in Manchester, but even then was having a national profile. One of the most famous editors in British press history, C.P. Scott, who was also very old. He'd been in position since 1872, nearly 50 years as the editor of a newspaper. He also owned the paper, which probably explains it. This was a much smaller circulation, only 35,000, but of course, famously, it had been one of the leading critics of the government's policy during the War of Independence. Interestingly, it did praise the treaty very much and did a 180-degree about turn and praised the coalition government for having seen the treaty through. So having been bitterly critical between 1919 and 1921, in 1922, because it believes that this is the way to go, this negotiated settlement with Ireland, it comes out strongly in favour of the government, at least in most respects. The Daily Herald, in some respects, is the most radical paper. It was independently owned, but was certainly pro-Labour. Daily circulation, 100,000. Its editor was George Lansbury. I think many of us remember that Angela Lansbury, the actress, died there about a month ago. This is her father. He was a socialist agitator and became an MP and also leader of the Labour Party at times. This had been one of the few papers that had come out from the very beginning as militantly against the First World War and was absolutely hostile to the coalition in every respect. And it's interestingly, of all the papers that you can look at, this is about the only paper in Britain that I found where there's even a hint of sympathy for the anti-treaty position. Practically all the others, with this exception, in effect, take the side of the provisional government. Okay, to begin, and I said there's so much here that I probably will have to skip some. This is an editorial on a crucial speech given by Winston Churchill on the 28th of June. This is a couple of days after the assassination of Henry Wilson and a few days before the attack on the forecourts. In this speech, Churchill had come out very clearly and basically said to the provisional government, do your duty. In private, a letter had been sent from Churchill to the provisional government and basically said, if you don't attack the forecourts, we will, using the remaining British garrison in Dublin. And that's an important point, and I'll be coming back to that later on. So the paper found something encouraging about Churchill's speech and also some things which it disagreed with. With regard to his speech, it did not disturb O'Connor's bandits in their occupation of the law courts in Dublin or interrupt the progress of their campaign of atrocities with which the assassination of Sir Henry Wilson, occurring immediately after the defeat of republicanism at the polls, of course the general election had taken place only a few days before, was undoubtedly connected directly or indirectly. But the paper did take succour from the general tenor of the speech. It established the fact that the British government intends to see the treaty carried out without more procrastination, or to regard it as violated and done with, and to resume its liberty of action. In effect saying if the provisional government did not act directly against the forecourts garrison, the British government would in effect declare all bets were off, that the treaty was null and void, and the British would basically reoccupy Ireland. For many weeks we have witnessed the incredible spectacle of this band of murderous fanatics left in absolutely unchallenged possession of the law courts in the heart of the Irish capital. Why has it been tolerated by Mr. Collins and his colleagues? There are some obvious but hardly satisfactory reasons. To deal with these rebels effectively would have meant bloodshed, and it is intelligible that the first Irish government of Ireland desired not to have blood on its hands. The answer to that is that if it will not use force, it cannot save Ireland from destruction. So perhaps a surprising degree of understanding of why the provisional government had held its hand for the intervening 76 months. But as far as the Telegraph was concerned, the killing of Wilson was a trigger point, and that toleration of dissent, as it were, certainly in terms of the forecourts, could not continue. So the Telegraph said that the British government had been very patient, arguably too patient in its approach. But it said that there was some benefit to the government not having intervened during that time. The British government has thus placed itself in a position quite beyond the reach of criticism. It has gone to the uttermost lengths for peace and settlement, and the whole world is its witness. It calls for the suppression of the Republican organisation. So the British government, having refused to intervene despite the worrying development of the previous 6 months, was now in a stronger position to make that intervention. We'll just jump to the final paragraph. We believe with Bona Law that the government means to see this thing through. On no other terms could they continue to receive the support of public opinion, i.e. British public opinion, if they did not if the government did not put pressure on the provisional government to attack the forecourts, the British government would be under threat. Not, of course, from a military threat, but in terms of mass defections of its supporters. This is the editorial in the same paper a few days later, after the attack has been carried through and has been successful. The capture of the forecourts is an event which must have a most valuable moral effect on the whole situation in Southern Ireland. It has proved what more than anything else needed to be demonstrated, that the provisional government intends to govern and possesses the means to assert its authority in spite of the worst that a nation-wrecking conspiracy can do. It was an act of will that needed to be shown, and the government had shown that it had the nerve to carry the deed through. The provisional government shown that it is a power not to be defied and insulted with impunity, and that if it must use force, it will go through with the task to the end. The besotted fanatic who had insolently flaunted his challenge in the face of the national authority for many weeks had been taught the difference between politic patience and weakness. As far as the paper was concerned, the government had shown patience, but it wasn't weak. So just jump to the final paragraph here, because again I'm conscious of the fact that I probably have too much. It is enough for the moment to know that the provisional government has justified the confidence which our own government has placed in its determination to uphold and, if necessary, to fight for the treaty. And this is the crucial point. And to know also what its enemies in Ireland deny, that its recent action has been taken solely upon its own initiative in advance of any representations addressed to it from the British government. And that wasn't true. The British government had made it abundantly clear to Collins by the communications from London that if Collins and the provisional government didn't act, it would do so. In effect, the press is already seeking to wipe the British fingerprints off the smoking gun of the attack on the forecourts. This is the Manchester Guardian, of course, supportive of the government at this point, albeit it had been critical of the British government before. It compared the assassination of Henry Wilson to that of Franz Ferdinand and said that we can either go down one road, which is to treat this, as it were, moderately, or we can use this as a casus belli, as an excuse to go to war. There are not wanting among the diehards of an English party, the Tories, men who would follow the Austrian and German example and visit upon the whole of a weak neighbour nation the punishment of a murderous fanatic. Good and evil are seldom so unanimously or unmistakably on opposite sides in a parliamentary debate, talking about church speech. We cannot praise warmly enough the statesmanlike patience and forbearance with which our government, with Mr. Churchill for a faultless mouthpiece, has treated the inevitably imperfect attempts of the provisional government to carry out the terms of the treaty up to the recent election. The provisional government, has done what, under great difficulties, it could do. But it could do much more now it has the Irish people unquestionably at its back. And it is fair to ask that it should do so. So as far as the Guardian was concerned, the game changer hadn't been the assassination of Wilson, it had been the election result. And that, as it were, gave the government the mandate to take action against the anti-treaty position, and not simply as a reprisal for the killing of Wilson. This is a good point where it brings in the northern aspect. What we have to deal with is not one isolated murder, not one murder gang, but a long competition in murder between two murder gangs. But murder is murder whether it be committed on a great soldier on his threshold in London, or on a Roman Catholic woman standing on hers in Belfast. And of course there have been a number of such killings in the recent months. The blunder of all partisan hotheads on both sides is that they talk as if no murders existed or mattered except those done by that murder gang who suppose politics they do not share. Jumping forward, so that was in advance of the attack on the forecourts. This is after it. Again, we'll go to the second quote. Authority is not much in favour in an Ireland which throughout its history has been rebelling against it. Especially is authority suspect when it goes with machine guns and cannon into the streets to shoot down men who proclaim themselves loudly as the true defenders of Irish liberty. Yet the thing had to be done, and if done at all, it had to be done with all possible regard for life and property, but without fear and without relenting. It is a surgeon's work, and the surgeon hurts to save. So that was its rationale, its defence. The Daily Herald has a very different take, as it were, with the left-wing perspective. There is nothing, and again this is in advance of the attack, there is nothing a true Tory loves as well as a little blustering and sabre-rattling. He likes to pose imperially. He adores ultimatums. There is a pity that these emotional needs cannot satisfy themselves with Miss Dell's novels, a popular novelist at the time, or with the movies. For in the world of politics, they are apt to be dangerous. It is no doubt very splendid to tell Mr. Collins that he has got to break up Mr. O'Connor's organisation. Sir James Craig, by the way, is not ordered to break up the Orange organisation for intimidation and murder. But it's also incredibly foolish. If the British government were wise enough to hold its hand, the Free State might successfully come through its initial difficulties without any internal fighting. In effect, there is no need to go to war. That there is, as it were, a peaceful resolution that could be found if the British do not intervene. And this is the day after the attack begins. The peace which skill and a wise patience had preserved in Ireland is at an end. The streets of Dublin are the theatre of a new war. The most tragic in Ireland's tragic history is as a civil war. We believe that this disaster could have been avoided, that it would have been avoided had the Irish leaders been left entirely free to handle their own policies and to pursue their own problems and to pursue their own policy. But the British government, acting hotly under the emotion of Sir Henry Wilson's death, must needs intervene. And its intervention has hastened, if not brought, disaster. It was the British reaction to Wilson's killing, not the treaty split, that had produced bloodshed. The bloodshed in Dublin today follows so closely on the British Cabinet's imperious threat to abrogate the treaty unless the forecourts were attacked. Sorry, there's a spelling mistake there. That it is impossible to disassociate the two. British Toryism, we do not doubt, is delighted at its handiwork. Civil war fostered and in fact provoked by enemies of Ireland in this country may be an excuse for a new intervention. The perception that the British wanted, that the right wing of the Conservative Party sought civil war in Ireland, as it were, as an excuse to roll back on the concessions of the treaty. Okay, moving on to the death of Michael Collins. It's interesting that, of course, the death occurs on the 22nd. For some reason, most of the British papers didn't react until the 24th. Not quite sure why that was, because news was certainly circulating on the evening of the 22nd in Ireland, and certainly on the 23rd. So this is the Daily Telegraph. And again, remember, this is a Conservative supporting paper. Another grievous blow has fallen Ireland. By the sudden death of Mr. Arthur Griffith a few days ago, the Free State lost its shrewdest brain. Now it's lost its commander-in-chief. We do not lament the fate of Mr. Michael Collins the less profoundly because we cannot forget that he, the latest victim of the ambush, was himself the chief director and organiser of ambushes when he was engaged what he and his friends called Ireland's fight for freedom. In fact, the Telegraph saying, we don't forget what was happening this time in the last 2 or 3 years. Alas, there is no assurance that the horror and indignation which the deed will arouse throughout the whole world will bring to an Ireland an end to this senseless butchery. Unfortunately, it is much more likely that so signal a success, as it will be styled by the Republican irregulars, will encourage them to further exploits of like nature. In effect, far from bringing everyone to their senses, it's likely to embolden the Republicans. We deeply regret that fate has denied him the opportunity of developing into an even greater figure than we know him to have been. Again, this is coming from a Conservative newspaper, so perhaps unexpected praise. The dead man, beyond all doubt, was of the stuff of which great men are made. He was a bitter and implacable enemy of England, while the British garrison remained in Ireland, and Ireland was not free to govern herself in her own way. He was the most dangerous foe we had. I think this is where they probably don't understand the editorial, the editor didn't understand the situation in Ireland as being revealed in this next quote. it is quite probable that neither Mr. Collins nor Mr. Griffith realised the full extent of the storm against which they would have to battle, and the slenderness of their majority in the Dáil and the strength of the irreconcilable Fenian elements in the IRA were probably the reasons which drove them to take up so stiff and provocative an attitude towards the Northern Parliament. I think there were other reasons. I think both Collins and Griffith knew quite well the extent of hostility to the treaty settlement. Okay, so Conservative newspaper giving praise, not unstinting praise, to one of their deadly enemies from 2 years ago. The Manchester Guardian, which of course had criticised the government far more than the Republican side during the War of Independence. This is its response to Collins' death. That faction which is responsible for his death actually claims to supersede him and those who have acted with him in the leadership of a people which by every means in its power has repudiated them. The measures so far taken against them have been of extraordinary leniency. In spite of the enormous material damage they have done, they have been treated as misguided rather than as criminal. Surrender would at any time have been accepted as opening the door to reconciliation. That will be more difficult now because blood bars the way. Such tolerance may have been wise, it was certainly humane. It remains to be seen whether it can indefinitely continue. So a sort of slightly menacing tone to a paper that criticised the British government for taking very stringent measures against the IRA during the War of Independence, and it now seems to be calling for very stringent measures to be taken by the provisional government against the Republicans. Mr. Collins had a great name amongst his countrymen. He was full of courage, full of resource, and he was moderate and conciliatory, as well as prompt to action and regardless of danger. Such qualities have endeared him to his countrymen, but they are possessed, it may be, in no less by others amongst his comrades. What will be harder to supply is his experience in command and in the conduct of large affairs. There may be other great men, but a key figure has disappeared because of the experience that he had, and he will be impossible to replace. This last tragedy brings home only more poignantly the desperate folly and weakness of the whole enterprise of which it is the latest outcome. There are no blows inflicted by an outside power. It is Irishmen who are guilty of the blood of Irishmen, and it is Ireland's own sons who are spreading ruin over the land. Not surprisingly, the Herald takes a... we'll just have a quick look before the Herald. This is where the Guardian is anxious lest the killing of Collins and the fact that the Civil War wasn't going 100%, as it were, in the direction of the provisional government, might have given an excuse to the right wing of the Conservative Party, which of course at this point is just about to withdraw from the coalition, an excuse to go on the offensive. There will not be wanting those who will find in these things the fulfilment of all, and more than all, the evil they had foretold from the establishment of Irish self-government and the justification of their own opposition. There will be Tories who will say, "We told you so." What Ireland is suffering now is in part our own doing, but historically. Emancipation, any time since it was first proposed 36 years ago, would, until the last 6 of them, have brought to Ireland, if freely accorded, order and peace. We waited too long. We did more. 2 years ago, we let murder loose in Ireland with the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. And murder, once let loose, is not easily chained up again. That may, in part at least, account for the present evils. It may also give ground for believing that they are not destined to endure. We have now, i.e. the British, have withdrawn, and this may, in the long run, as well, remove the sword. The Herald has a different take. Collins was a brave soldier and patriot. There have been many such in the history of the world, and almost always they have carried their lives in their hands. What distinguished Collins and gave him his greatness was the union in him of boyish carelessness with practical and constructive wisdom. His death is a tragedy, the tragedy of waste. He could have done, was doing so much, and now, save through the memory and example he has left, he can do no more. Ireland is at this moment a terrible object lesson in the futility of force. But it was the British who began the use of force. So again, the Herald constantly coming back, as it were, to the culpability of the British government in the situation. And this is where you get, as it were, one of the few expressions of sympathy in a British newspaper with the anti-treaty side. In Ireland, both sides are patriotic. Both sides are convinced they are in the right. Old comrades in arms who fought side by side against the British invasion will not now doubt one another's good faith or idealism. But what is this idealism which finds its expression in bombs and revolvers leading to ruin, chaos, the disruption of all ordered life, the cessation of all happy human relationship, the murder of the country's best? The strife in Ireland is fratricidal. It is between people who desire nothing but their country's good. Is it not plain that they should get together and work peacefully, constructively, for the end they hold in common? If they go on as they have begun, they will then achieve not liberty, but self-destruction. A blatant cry from the heart of, as it were, the English left wing, that the differences which were manifesting themselves in the deaths of those such as Colin be brought to an end immediately. But crucially, as it were, saying that the Republicans are not demons. Won't go into any great detail over here. The death of Erskine Childers, the Telegraph, in contrast to some accounts which I've read about the British reaction to the death of Collins, there is no celebration within the Daily Telegraph as to the execution of Erskine Childers. There is a far greater emphasis upon, as well, the memory of the role that he played serving Britain in the South African War and during the First World War. And as it were, this sense of curiosity as to how on earth did he end up, as it were, being executed as an anti-treaty, an Irish anti-treaty supporter. A strange career full of contradictions and complexities has closed with the execution of Erskine Childers. But there is nothing in the account, I've just given a summary there, I won't go into it. There is no glorying in the death of Childers. Some in Britain, I think Winston Churchill certainly did rejoice in his death. But interestingly, this Conservative journal did not. Manchester Guardian, its editorial on the death of Childers. To those who knew how Erskine Childers devoted himself, however misguidedly at the end, to the cause of Ireland, it must seem the height of human tragedy that she had come to be condemned and executed by an Irish government. This is a man who voluntarily gave everything he had, and he had a great deal, and he gave it to Ireland, and he ends up being executed by an Irish government. To hear of a brave and devoted man condemned to death by those who were once his comrades is a terrible thing. We may be convinced he has been doing his utmost to destroy the real freedom for Ireland, for an abstract notion of freedom, but such conviction does not efface the sense of tragedy, that this is pure loss to everybody that a man of this quality should die in this manner. And this is well, it's the next page is the crucial one. Childers brought to the Sinn Féin movement a mind subtle, analytical, logical almost to excess. But his spirit of single-hearted and selfless devotion had made him use that mind only in subserving and not in criticising the uncompromising ideals of the movement. I think this following quote is very insightful. Possibly the fact that he came into it from outside made him feel the more that it was not for him to shape or change the ideals in which the Irish people found themselves, but only to serve them and to see that no action of his compromised them in any way. As the outsider, he felt he couldn't query the views of the Irish people, even though he believed that he was one of those. I think this is the next one is a very memorable way in which C.P. Scott expressed this idea. All might have been well if the Republicans had not so identified the church with the creed, the cause with the symbols, the real facts of social and political life with the names by which they had been described. That when the two were forced apart, they had to choose, and they followed the abstractions and fought against the realities. The temptation to render uncritical devotion to an ideal is not one which troubles ordinary men, but extraordinary ones. And clearly, he regarded Childers as extraordinary. The harm that it does, but when we are faced with and have to fight against the harm that it does, let us remember that those who do succumb to it are men who might easily, in more healthy circumstances, have done great service to the state. That for all the Guardian disagreed fundamentally with how Childers had conducted himself, it recognised greatness in his being. The Daily Herald, perhaps surprisingly, is actually rather critical of Childers because he regarded him as a militarist who had helped the British government, at least in part, drove the British government into the war, the First World War. We'll just jump to the second paragraph. The book by which he was most widely known was The Riddle of the Sands, in which the element of romance and adventure in him was allied to a problem of international politics. The naval scare, which as much as anything else precipitated the Great War. So even though the Daily Herald, a left-wing paper, was not unsympathetic to the Republican side, Childers, as it were, accepts from this consideration because of his past militarist association with Britain. He said that his wife, an American of strong pro-Irish feeling, influenced him in the direction of his latest action in siding with De Valera as near irreconcilable. It is more likely that sudden realisation of the bitter injustices which Ireland had suffered had the natural effect on an emotional and aggressive temperament, which drove to extreme a man to whom peaceful inactivity was a discomfort. So a much less complimentary take on Childers than The Guardian had done, even though the Herald was much more sympathetic to the cause in which Childers had served. And so we move to the death of Seán Hales. This headline this page in the Irish Independent gives you a very good idea, as it were, of what was happening and the sheer incredible press of events at precisely the time, almost to the hour, that Hales was killed. The headline is about Seán Hales being shot dead, and this is the subtext. Gallant soldier's tragic end, Brigadier Hales shot down on way to Doyle. 8 bullet wounds, Deputy Speaker O'Malley badly wounded, Dublin appalled at the tragedy. But notice 2 other headlines on exactly the same day. The elections to the Senate, of course a key part of the new legislature, and the fact that Northern Ireland had voted itself out of the jurisdiction of the Free State on exactly that day. One point to note, and this is something that I think is probably less true now than it was of the newspaper industry at the day. In those days you had several different editions of newspapers. The first edition, morning edition, perhaps the lunchtime edition. And you do get differences between them depending on what had happened in the morning. As well, this is the rolling news. We're familiar with the concept of rolling news from 24-hour news, Sky News and BBC News and RTE News. But that was the equivalent of the day, that the same newspaper could produce several different editions and update itself constantly. So the evening newspapers on the 7th of December were dominated, these are the British newspapers in their coverage of Irish affairs, were dominated by the news of the assassination. But on the 8th of December, merely the following day, they were dominated more by the news of the executions that followed as a reprisal. And Hales' death quickly falls off the front pages. This is just a news timeline, literally hour by hour, and you can see why. At midnight on the 6th of December, the Free State comes into being. At midnight the following day, the Shannon elections are announced. Around 2:30, Seán Hales is assassinated. At 4 o'clock, the Northern Ireland Parliament votes itself out of the Irish Free State. And about 8 o'clock the following morning, you have the executions. And it's some of these huge events, one after another in the space of little more than 48 hours. And the Hales assassination, as it were, has to fight for attention amongst all these other stories in the way that the attack on the forecourt, in the way that the killing of Collins or execution of Childers hadn't had to do so. So just to give some headlines and to illustrate how, from a British perspective, the death of Hales had to find a place with other news stories. So this is the Birmingham Gazette. There was a sensational murder trial. They had them in those days. And you can see that's the main headline. And it's only on the right-hand side as you look that you see the account of 2 Irish MPs shot in Dublin Street. This is one of the main newspapers in Newcastle. And it does mention the masthead, or just under the masthead, the MP assassinated in the new Irish Parliament, but most of the other front page stories are dealing with English stories. This is the coverage in the Leicester Daily Mercury, and it basically covers the main facts as they were known at that point. As announced briefly in yesterday's Mercury, and this had made the stop press, 2 Irish deputies were the victims of a street attack by Dublin terrorists, Mr Seán Hales being shot dead and Mr Pádraig O'Malley wounded. The victims were in a jaunting car on the way to the door. The driver of the car says he believes the shots came from a hotel porch. Mr Hales called out that he was shot and Mr O'Moya told the driver to go on. He drove to Jervis Street Hospital and Mr O'Moya, with assistance, was able to walk into the hospital, but Mr Hales, however, showed no sign of life. 3 soldiers who were in the car near returned the fire and gave chase, an officer emptying his revolver as he ran. When the announcement of the tragedy was made in the Dáil, it was revealed that ministers who live together in one house can hardly leave it for fear of assassination. Practically all the members of the Parliament, and certainly all the ministers, are said to be under the sentence of death by the rebels. A short account, but as it were, conveys the urgency of the situation. Liverpool, of course, had a very substantial Irish community, and there was therefore, as well, more attention given to the killing in the Liverpool press than in practically any other regional newspapers. The Liverpool Post had its own correspondent in Dublin, so it didn't have to take the Press Association result. A fearful crime, and notice the language, a fearful crime was committed on the quays in Dublin this afternoon when 2 well-known members of Dáil Éireann were shot down by a group of men. One of the deputies, Brigadier John Hales, was killed, and the other, Mr Pádraig O'Moya, the Deputy Speaker of the Dáil, was shot in the body and wounded. There can be little doubt that the movements of one or both had been under observation, and the men lay in wait for them. For some time past, many of the rural members of the Dáil have preferred to reside in government buildings during their visits to Dublin, rather than run any risks by taking lodgings outside. But apparently Mr O'Moya and Mr Hales did not consider it necessary to live constantly under a military guard. I'll just step over here so I can see it. Mr O'Moya had been in the habit of visiting the Ormond Hotel on Ormond Quay, little more than a quarter of a mile from O'Connell Bridge. This afternoon at 2:20, both deputies left the hotel and called a jaunting car with the intention of driving to the meeting of the Dáil. Mr Hales had lunched with the proprietor of the hotel, who was a cousin of Mr O'Moya. As the 2 deputies entered the car, the assailants appeared and fired 6 shots, most of which took effect. Mr Hales was shot in the temple and in the lung, fell against the driver. Mr O'Moya received a shot in the body. Seeing Mr Hales' condition, he ordered the driver to take them to the Jervis Street Infirmary, where the former expired as he was being taken in. Okay, so that's the same here. No, sorry, I'm done. Am I done all right? We'll jump ahead simply because I'm conscious of the passage of time. We're almost at the end. This is the only editorial that I could find in a British newspaper that dealt specifically with the death of Seán Hales, and the language that's used indicates the bitterness that was felt in Britain, not in Ireland, but in Britain at the direction things had taken. So this is a Conservative supporting newspaper in Sunderland, of all places. So it's the editorial on the 8th of December, the day after. A bad start, the De Valera's must be rounded up. It's doubly a pity that yesterday, only the 2nd day of the new Irish Free State's official existence, should have been marred by the unspeakable outrage in Dublin, where a member of the Dáil was foully assassinated and the Deputy Speaker of that body wounded. Those bad friends of Britain, and of Ireland too, who have for months denounced the treaty as a base betrayal, will of course make great capital out of the event and will exploit it with the object of proving that it is disastrous to entrust a race like the Irish with the responsibilities of self-government. So remember, this is a Conservative newspaper, but it's coming out strong to say, do not allow the diehards within the Conservative movement to make capital out of this to justify a reoccupation of Ireland. Nevertheless, after making full allowance for the widespread indignation which the tragedy will naturally arouse, we are certainly not prepared to admit it is merely the first of many forthcoming indications that our sister nation is unfitted for the status conferred on by the grant of Dominion Home Rule. On the contrary, we believe that this wretched event will arouse in her administrators still greater determination to stamp out, once and for all, the seeds of a rebellion does not in any way typify either the qualities or the aspirations of the average Irishman. The Dublin outrage is merely another indication that the gang of cutthroats, led by the dastardly Dago, De Valera, has yet to be exterminated. There is every confidence, however, that the new Free State government will eventually succeed in carrying out that task, difficult though it may be. Of course, the language is certainly of its time. One thing is certain. There can be no real peace in Ireland until De Valera is rounded up with his fellow murderers. He will hold out desperately until the last, for he probably knows there is no reason why he should not have the fate of Childers. Upon his head rests the blood of hundreds of men immeasurably better than himself. Ever since the days of his monstrously hypocritical pact with Michael Collins, a pact he celebrated by organising the Battle of the Door of the Dublin Forecourts, which of course he didn't, he has played the part of a traitor to the best interests of a country which, despite his alien blood, he has impudently adopted as his own. The fact that the Irish people, through the democratic medium of the ballot box, approved the treaty which was afterwards endorsed by the Dáil seems to have had no effect upon this man who in the past has prated so loudly about the evils of minority rule. Every good Irishman knows that De Valera's handful of hired assassins constitute a very tiny minority indeed, and yet this body of murderers is seeking by terrorism to impose its will upon a majority. We trust that the Free State military and police authorities will leave no stone unturned to bring the arch criminal to justice. In effect saying, whoever pulled the trigger on Seán Hales, it's Michael or Aidan De Valera who murdered him. Disquieting as the recurrent assassinations are, the fact that De Valera remains at large is even more disturbing. He has had quite enough rope. It is now high time that it was now used to hang him. If the latest Dublin murder has the effect, as it must, of stiffening the attitude of the authorities towards him, then Mr. Hales will not have died in vain. I suppose the one comment I would make on that is that that's the state of opinion about Irish affairs in Sunderland, about as far removed from Irish affairs as you could possibly get. It gives an indication of the passions that were being felt in Ireland at the time. You can only guess, of course, as to the passions that were being felt. And of course, that point at the end does anticipate the executions which are to follow literally as this editorial was being penned. Conclusions. Just general observations. The sincerity of interest in Ireland was palpable. All of the press were interested in what was happening in Ireland. It wasn't treated as some irrelevant thing of the past. That you sometimes hear that the British were glad to get rid of Ireland, or the British establishment were glad to be shot of it. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of that. There is a sincere interest in what is happening, and a sincere hope, I think, on all sides of the political spectrum that we've indicated here, that Ireland will come out well from the shattering experience of civil war. There seems to be genuine regret on all the sides, with the possible exception of the diehards, as to the human and material damage done by the civil war. It was treated as an exercise in just the most extreme that give rise to the most authentic sadness. All the mainstream newspapers supported the provisional government, and say it's only the Daily Herald that offered some understanding of the anti-treaty position, and even that understanding or sympathy changed after the death of Collins. There's still a tendency to blame Britain for everything, even within Britain, but the death of Collins, I think Liz mentioned earlier on, is a game changer in Britain as well as in Ireland. There was a genuine wish for peace, but simultaneous with that, there was also, of course, the search for scapegoats, who was to blame. Both the Herald and the Guardian, as we've already seen, did say Britain does not emerge from this with clean hands, that there is blood on British hands in different ways. But the main focal point for all of the papers, with the possible exception of the Herald, was De Valera. And on that point, it's important to remember, therefore, when De Valera comes to power in 1932, 10 years later, the extent of the hatred of De Valera in Britain should not be underestimated when we're having a look at the history of the 1930s as well as the 1920s. That's the last slide.